I'm really honored and delighted to be with you all today. And you know, I think back on the CARJ's second Racial Justice Conference, which was held in 2003. And I'm pretty sure that Anne was there, and I know that Kevin was there, because he provided us. I was part of the organizing team, and we looked to the diocese to get diocesan coordinators to bring people together within the individual diocese. And inevitably, the people who stepped forward to assist us were JNP members. And I remember Kevin provided us with these umbrella type things that we proceeded into Mass on Racial Justice Sunday with, identifying our various dioceses. And I say this because CARJ is celebrating 40 years of existence this year, which we feel is a pretty big deal, and in fact this month. And we are very grateful for and very proud of our ongoing association with NJPN. So I want to begin by saying a big thank you to you all. And just one more shameless plug for CARJ. We're having an event to celebrate 50 years later in the month, and Richard can give you all the details during lunch. Okay, extremism. Yeah, next slide, please. Thank you. I don't know what I'm going to do that. I'm going to ask you to just think for a minute. I mean, Kevin got us kind of going on this, but just think for a minute. When you see the word extremism written or you hear it spoken, what thoughts come into your head? I'm not going to ask you to answer, but just think about it for a moment, because it's one of those words that, you know, it can arouse yet strong thoughts. And I think part of the reason for this is because for at least the last 20 plus years, the word extremism in this country and in other countries has been linked to concepts such as terrorism, radicalization, incitement, intimidation, and concepts that are threatening and somewhat disconcerting. Today is in fact the second time in 2 weeks that I'm talking about this. And the first time, a couple weeks ago, it was a Zoom meeting, and there were 4 speakers, and I was the third of the 4 speakers. The first 2 speakers were Church of England priests, and they were speaking about how they lived their ministry in terms of community cohesion, peace, justice, reconciliation, care for the earth, you know, all these very uplifting and inspiring things. And then I spoke about extremism. And even though it was a Zoom, I could feel the deflation, the mood going down. And I really wish that I had been the first speaker so that they could then come along and uplift us. So I'm really delighted that today we've got the order right. So I will give you the slightly not so cheerful news, and Melanie is going to uplift and enlighten you. I have to tell you, Melanie and I have never met before. We met for the first time, literally a few minutes ago. And but I did Google her last night, and I thought, let me see who my co-facilitator is. And I thought, well, she has some YouTube videos, I'll watch one. I ended up watching 5. I was totally hooked. So I have no doubt that, you know, don't despair after my talk, because Melanie's coming and she will raise the mood a lot. Okay, next slide, please. So, Michael Gove, yeah. So this new definition is largely down to Community Secretary Michael Gove. He is the man behind this change. And having a new definition is a bugbear of his. It's something he has wanted to do for a long time. He's been pushing the government in this direction on a strategy to those whom he considers to be extremists for some time. And he has persuaded the government that the climate was right to introduce this new definition. And I think the mere fact that it was introduced to the House of Commons by Michael Gove rather than by the Home Secretary, James Cleverly, shows that this is very personal to him. But why a new definition? And why now? Well, the why I'm not so sure about, and Anne mentioned her doubts, and I think many others aren't so sure either. And therein lies the uncertainty that we'll come back to. But the why now, here are some reasons that Gove gave when he was unveiling it to the House of Commons. Okay, I can't see it, but I have it here. So he says the threat of extremism has been steadily growing for many years. I've just picked out bits of things that he said when he was presenting it to the House of Commons. While the government and its partners have worked hard to combat this threat, the pervasiveness of extremist ideologies in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Israel on 7th of October 2023 highlighted the need for further action. I think he's taken us in the direction of where he's going with this. This new definition of extremism adds to the tools to tackle this ever-evolving threat. This is in line with the first duty of government, to keep our citizens safe and our country secure. The definition updates the one set out in the 2011 Prevent Strategy and reflects the evolution of extremist ideologies and the social harms they create. It's all very heavy, it's all very intense, and it's somewhat threatening, you know, like if this doesn't happen, we are at risk. And just let me say briefly, the 2011 Prevent Strategy was a government strategy that was laid out to prevent domestic, again, extremism, stroke terrorism. It was couched in the words of extremism, but it was framed about radicalization and the threat from domestic terror links. So this was the old definition in the 2011 Prevent Strategy, and I'm sorry, that should read vocal or active. Define vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. It sounds good, but one of the difficulties with it is that as soon as you introduce the words fundamental British values, you've created a very subjective evaluation system. Because I think if we went around the room and asked what are fundamental British values, I remember years ago I was doing some racial justice training at Allen Hall. This was maybe 15 years ago. And they were seminarians from different parts of the world. And I asked them what did they see as fundamental British values. And some of the answers they gave were beer, fish and chips. You know, it was not what necessarily we would equate with fundamental British values, but you do open yourself up to a wide variety of views. Gove said in presenting it that he was very keen to remove any ambiguity from this definition, this existing definition, and many, however, would argue that he has done just the opposite with the new definition. So, new definition. The promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance that aims to 1. Negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, Or 2, undermine, overturn, or replace the UK's system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights. Or 3, intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve the results in 1 or 2. Wow. I'm going to leave that up there for a while because it can take a little while to sink in. Now, again, the inherent difficulty with this definition is that if we accept that Britain is a liberal democracy, as stated in Part 2, then in a free and democratic society with a plurality of opinions and beliefs, there are going to be so-called culture wars. And in many of these culture wars, debates that take place, both sides would argue that the other side is seeking to negate the fundamental rights of the others. And interestingly, it was a Tory MP, Miriam Cates, who spoke out when Gove presented this, and who warned that it could lead to a suppression of fundamental freedoms. She subsequently wrote on X, formerly Twitter, something that I think many of us would be able to endorse, and I'd like to read it to you. What does it even mean to undermine British values when there's no consensus and certainly no legal definition of what those values are? Some people think that gender-critical views are extreme. I think decriminalizing abortion to birth is extreme. Opposition politicians think the current government is extreme. Martin Luther King, William Wilberforce, and the suffragettes were all viewed as extremists. If extremist views are illegal, then the person who defines extremism has the power to curtail free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of association. This is the path to authoritarianism. Now, this came from a Tory MP. And Jonathan Hall, KC, he is the government's independent reviewer of state threat legislation. He described this new definition as the labeling of people as extremists by, I quote, ministerial decree. And he said there's a lack of safeguards in the absence of an appeal body. And that's an important fact. There is no appeal. If you are labeled an extremist, you can't challenge it in any way. Instead, the government is setting up what they call a new counter-extremism center of excellence, which just sounds so ridiculous. And it has been established by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And it has been set up to ensure consistent application of the extremism definition and engagement standards. And I can't remember the exact process, but I think this is going to be made up of academics who will determine if something is who or what groups are extremists. And then the final decision will be taken by Michael Gove as Community Secretary and James Cleverly as Home Secretary. It just seems, what could go wrong? And something else that is unusual with this is that there was no consultation. Generally, with these things, the government has a period of consultation. There was absolutely no consultation with anyone before it was introduced. Okay, next slide, please. So these are some of the assurances that the government gave, that Michael Gove gave when he was presenting it to the House. The definition will not target individuals or groups based on their beliefs or activism, but will instead focus on those promoting ideologies rooted in violence and intolerance. identified extremist groups will not face criminal sanctions, but will be excluded from government funding and engagement. No organizations have yet been classified as extremist under the new criteria. Now, he said that, but he used parliamentary privilege when he was introducing it to name 5 organizations that might be selected, that might qualify under it. 3 of them were Muslim organizations, and 2 of them were far-right organizations. He said at the time that he would be producing a list of organizations that fell under this. Nothing has happened since, but I'll get to that. The wording is non-statutory and creates no new legal powers. So, at least to start with, it's not statutory, so it won't apply to councils, to the CPS, police forces, universities, etc. But those classified as extremist will be denied government grants, ministerial meetings, access to the senior civil service, honors, and public appointments. At the moment, and I emphasize that, at the moment, environmental, trans rights, and gender-critical campaigners will not be in the frame. But many critics of the policy fear that it's only a matter of time before they're targeted. I'm sure Melanie will have more to say about that. But for now, let me just say that there's a lot of concern about how the definition will be applied in practice. And obviously, there's a danger that any government could apply it unfairly by defining causes it disagrees with politically as extremist, but excluding groups it agrees with or knows they're going to vote for. And you can see there's a lot of range for interpretation here. So people are very concerned about how it will be interpreted. Next one, please. So this is a letter. Over 400 British imams and religious scholars have signed a letter rejecting this, and I've just extracted a bit of it. We note that the discourse of extremism relies on the faulty and academically baseless neoconservative notion that ideology is a cause of political violence. We observe that Mr. Gove has a history of targeting Islam and Muslims under the label of Islamism. The hypocrisy of Mr. Gove et al., who coercively apply British values, which includes democracy, while simultaneously suppressing democratic participation. It's cut up there. Anyway, that opposes their agenda is glaringly obvious. So this was a general letter, but there has been a lot of response to. I have not heard of any specific Catholic response, and perhaps somebody could correct me, but certainly the Archbishops of Canterbury and York issued a joint statement warning the government that this definition risks, and I quote, disproportionately targeting Muslim communities and driving us apart. And I think this is at the root of concerns that is shared by many church leaders. And many people feel that in its present format, this definition is heavily laden with both racial and religious resonances. Amnesty International stated that, I quote, this dangerously sweeping approach to labeling groups and individuals extremist is yet another smash and grab on our human rights by a government which has become a serial offender in this regard. The Muslim Association of Britain branded the definition, I quote, an egregious assault on civil liberties. And again, within the Tory party, senior Tory MP David Davis said, quote, restricting free speech and forcing those who hold views inimical to our own out of the public debate and into the shadows is an authoritarian act that will only serve to further alienate those who are susceptible to extremist views. So this new definition came in with a lot of fanfare and has died down with a bit of a whimper. We've heard nothing about it. It was introduced into the House of Commons on the 14th of March. There was a lot about it beforehand. And as I say, Gove said he was going to produce a list of people and organizations who might fall, and none of this has happened. And one reason is, next slide please, Frank Hester. You'll remember this debate that started up. Less than a week after the new definition was unveiled, The Guardian revealed that multi-million-pound Tory donor, Frank Hester, had previously said, this is something that's very difficult for me to even say, that looking at Diane Abbott made him want to hate all black women and that she should be shot. He then conceded that his remarks were rude, but insisted that they had nothing to do with the color of her skin or her gender. I mean, his remarks were like a dictionary definition of racism. You could not have a more open and shut case. But the government sent ministers out that day to appear on TV and to say that his comments were unfortunate. They were ill-timed. They were, clumsy. But they refused to use the word racist. It was only at 4 o'clock that afternoon that Kenny Badenoch came out and said, well, obviously these are racist comments. And it still took the Prime Minister another 2 hours to say, yes, these were racist comments. So people began saying that these comments were not only racist, but extremist. And Michael Gove was challenged about it. You have a new definition for extremism. How are these comments not extremist? And when he was questioned about it, this was his reply. I take these things seriously. It would be the case that any individual would have to follow a rigorous process. It would be a due diligence process that would be conducted very carefully. A process that would follow independent advice. Well, as far as we can see, that process hasn't begun. And nothing has been done. But I think the government felt they had to retract because the timing could not have been worse for them. So none of that has taken place. They've stayed mute about it, and we've heard very little about the definition since. So I think we wait and see, we watch, we see how the government navigates these complex and contentious issues down the line. But I think we have to be vigilant, because I think it's all very open. But I would like to just close with an upbeat message about extremism. And this is from Martin Luther King. And after being accused of extremism, Martin Luther King criticized the mainstream usage of the term in a letter from his Birmingham prison. And he said, but though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was Jesus not an extremist for love? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Was not Martin Luther an extremist? So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice.